Hello, welcome to the Datacolor 2013 webinar series. Today our co-sponsor is Joby. Now I'm not sure if there's anybody listening who doesn't know who Joby is. Just in case, all I have to do is say GorillaPod and you suddenly know who I'm talking about. So we will feature a few Joby products in this webinar, and we're covering a topic that Joby was interested in seeing covered. So we're hoping that you're looking forward to talking about small scale and macro photography. I'm David Tobie. I'm Product and Technology Manager at the Imaging Division at Datacolor. And my partner in crime is David Saffir, who's been presenting with us over the last year and a half in our webinars. David's a professional photographer in Southern California. He does fine art, printmaking, photo education, various things. And this winter he and I are going to do some videography together. So hopefully we'll get to share that with you at some point. So without further ado, I'm going to tell you to please put your GoToWebinar control panel someplace where you can see it and open up the section that says questions so that you can read along with the answers that people give, or the questions that people ask and the answers that I give. We'll try to keep up with whatever questions people come up with. And David's going to do the majority of the heavy lifting in this webinar, and I'll chime in on request or when something particular comes up that's of interest. And at the end of the webinar, we have count them, three prizes to give away, two of them from Joby, one of them from Datacolor, as well as having a discount code. So stick around and maybe you'll win something, but even if you don't, you'll certainly get a good discount offer. So I'm going to hand things over to David Saffir. Thank you for being with us today, David.
Hello, David. Thank you for having me on board again. And hello, everybody. I'm David Saffir. I'm a photographer, a fine art printmaker. I live in Southern California. I've been on the road a lot recently, doing two things, working in a workshop in Dallas, Texas on screen-to-print match, and then on to some videography seminars with DSLR Dynamics in various cities. So in the breaks here, I'm working on this webinar on small-scale and macro photography. And in fact, this image on the front page is kind of interesting. It's a macro photograph, but it's also made with a technique called focus stacking, which we'll get into a little bit later on in the presentation. Now, small subject and macro photography, let's just introduce this really briefly. It's a technical aspect of photography. Macro literally means large scale. The classic definition is life size or greater. In other words, 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 ratio. And there is some crossover between what one might call small scale photography and macro. But both of them let you see into a new world. You see things with the camera that you probably would never see with the eye alone. And I think that alone makes it extremely interesting. It's demanding in some respects in that you really have to pay attention to your technique. You have to manage the camera supports, and your subject. One interesting thing is that improvements in some small sensor cameras make macro and small scale imaging more accessible. The smaller chips give us greater depth of field in some respects, and the cameras are much easier to handle. They're smaller, and some of them have live view, which makes it easier to see the subject as compared to looking through a viewfinder. So some interesting things happening in the world of more accessible technology. Now, most people, though, use a DSLR, but one can, as I said just a moment ago, use pocket cameras or even mirrorless cameras. You do need a lens with close focusing capability. Now, you can take small-scale photographs without a macro lens, but what it means is that your lens-to-subject distance may be fairly long, and you may not get to the true macro ratios of 1-to-2 or 1-to-1 reproduction ratios. One of the other things about macro and other lenses is that we've got really greatly improved coatings for these lenses. And what does that really mean? In particular, in the box between the lens and the sensor, there's a lot of light bouncing around. And the coatings on the rear element of the lens diminish the amount of light that's coming bouncing around back and forth. And that light control improves the contrast and, in a way, the sharpness of the image that you're taking, particularly in circumstances where you're using bright lights and a small aperture. Now, one can also use what's called extenders, which we'll talk about in a little while, and reversing rings. In terms of camera movement, you really have to watch and control the camera. You need some sort of solid foundation. The GorillaPod can be one of those devices. A small base tripod or a table tripod. A remote release is a good thing. Frequently, one of the things that people neglect that can be very important is to have a subject mount or a support for the subject so it doesn't move around. This is particularly true if you're shooting outdoors. Let's say you're shooting a wildflower. It's been my experience that as soon as I go to press the shutter that the wind comes up and the flower starts bobbing around. So there are little supports. You can also make a support out of an alligator clamp and a pipe cleaner if you want to, or a little piece of wire. In any event, sometimes you do need support to support the subject to keep the image nice and sharp and eliminate subject movement. And lighting. There's a number of ways that one can light these things. You can simply use existing daylight. You can use diffusers or screens that diffuse direct sunlight, which is how this shot was taken here. You can actually provide artificial lighting and a little stage to shoot your macro and small subject photographs as well. Now, it doesn't matter if the DSLR has a full frame or a cropped frame sensor. Macro lenses are available in a variety of focal lengths. I think I've even seen macro lenses that are up to 200. And of course, you can use telephoto lenses to take macro type photographs. This just means that your working distance is going to be really quite a bit longer than it would be with a true macro lens. So the close focus capability, for example, with a 60mm micro Nikkor is about a ½ an inch, 6/10 of an inch. That means that you're practically touching your subject. There's a photograph later on in this presentation which I took with a 400mm lens, shooting at about f5.6, and I was a good 6 feet away, and the subject still did fill the frame, but it was a completely different setup. Macro lenses are very, very well managed technically. They're built to exacting specifications. They usually are very flat field and have superior aperture control, particularly at small apertures. But one of the things about them too is that their chromatic control, their control of color is excellent. Very rarely we'll see chromatic aberration with a macro lens. My personal preference in the macro field is 100mm in terms of quality and the working distance and the versatility. A 60 really requires you to get pretty darn close to your subject. A 100 lets you back up a little bit. Some people prefer a 200, although I think that's a little bit big and bulky for tiny subjects. One can also reverse a normal lens, and you get a big increase in diopter or magnification. There are Photodiox, for example, makes reversing rings where you can turn the lens around and place the objective element of the lens, actually mount that to the camera mount and turn it around, and all of a sudden you've got an order of magnification that would never be even remotely possible with it mounted in a conventional configuration. You can use extension tubes and bellows. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. LensBaby makes a macro lens, and then there's software that can help you with macro photography, both from Adobe, and another good example is Helicon. So if you reverse a normal lens, a lot of people use a 40 or 50mm lens. They use an adapter ring, such as Photodiox, with a 52mm thread. There's an issue with aperture control. Default is to wide open, but some adapters or enablers have tabs which can manipulate the aperture. And if you're going to be doing this kind of work, I suggest that you pay a little bit extra and get a device that has that feature on it. Some cameras, such as Nikon, some lenses from Nikon, not all, have a manual aperture adjustment, and that is also a very useful thing. Depth of field is a big challenge with this. You've really got to manage things. Generally speaking, if you're not going to use software controls or software stacking, which I'm going to get into later in this presentation. You've really got to manage things so that your prime subject, or even a part of your prime subject, such as the eyes of an insect, are in focus, and you may have to give up perfect focus in parts of your image to get what you want in overall. David, is this one of your images?
I believe it is, and the thing that aesthetically, the thing to point out here is that a bee in a flower is a story. A bee covered with pollen in a flower is a better story. But a bee covered in pollen in a flower with natural light and dark and light areas and this sense of place, that the depth that comes from that lighting is probably a better story than what you would get under many, less controlled lighting situations. So oftentimes you're going to go into some issues in artificial lighting, setting up what we jokingly refer to as an Amazon box to take small shots of small objects under controlled lighting inside. But an image like this, where you have natural lighting and variations in the amount of exposure, is something that you can look for naturally, or you can control it. Oftentimes you can control lighting in a macro simply by having a reflector in your other hand and either holding it up as a light shield to eliminate light from an area, or intentionally using it as a bounce to create light in an area. Often the bounce is the brightest light source in the image, rather than having direct lighting be the major light source. You often in a macro will want to avoid direct lighting, because in such a small subject it can be too much and too harsh. You might intentionally place your body between your subject and the sun, and then use a reflector to give secondary lighting instead. So there are many different variations on that, and this image brings a few of them to mind. Before I hand the mic back to you, Dave, I'll mention that if you're thinking of cameras with manual aperture rings, and you mentioned Nikon specifically, a manual aperture ring is wonderful for macro, it's wonderful for time-lapse, and it's wonderful for video. So one thing for people to consider is, as your wish list for your next purchase is being developed, consider getting a lens that could serve all three of those purposes. By having a manual aperture ring, it could be excellent for macro, it could be excellent for time-lapse shooting, and it could be excellent for shooting video with your DSLR as well. Thanks.
Yeah, just for clarity's sake, what David's referring to, sort of indirectly, but for clarity's sake, there are some lenses that are controlled strictly by the electronics in the camera, and they do not have a manual aperture ring or a click ring at the base of the lens. Those are certainly good lenses. There's nothing wrong with them, but they're not as versatile in terms of the range of use that David was talking about. Extension tubes are simply a light, tight tube or cylinder that fits between the regular lens and the camera. It moves the lens farther from the camera and the front element closer to the subject, and basically it shortens the working distance. If you can stack them, as you can see here. There's 3 of them stacked together. The more you stack them, the shorter your working distance gets, and the less depth of field you will have. Some extension tubes or extension rings will communicate with the camera, and others do not. On the camera that I have an extension ring that helps me evaluate, I believe it helps me evaluate the focus. The focusing part of it still works. I can still see the focus indicator, and that's about it. Everything else is manual. That means that aperture and shutter are manual. And you have to understand that you're going to lose some amount of light by creating this distance, and you're going to have to increase your exposure accordingly. And I apologize for the formula. I'm simply going to say that the longer the extension, the more light is lost. It's the old inverse square rule, biting this again. But if you take an 80 millimeter lens 80 millimeters away from the sensor plane, you lose 1 stop of light. If you use a 14 millimeter extension on an 80 millimeter lens, you lose about a half a stop. I suggest what you do is go to Wikipedia and look up this formula. They have a really good explanation about this. I put this in here just for the fun of it to make people's eyes bug out, but in no way am I going to attempt to explain it.
Or to make fish's eyes bug out? That was a clever choice of photos for that, David.
Now, supports. The supports in macro photography are one of the keys to success. There's very little you can do in macro photography, hand holding, that's going to work for you. In part because you have to stop down to get any kind of depth of field. And of course, I'm sorry, you're going to stop down to get some depth of field out of it, but the fact is that a lot of the time you're working with a diffuser or another light blocking device, so it's relatively low light. You don't necessarily want to crank the ISO up, to the max, because on a very small subject, any kind of noise is really an issue. So you need a sturdy support. Now, if you follow my cursor on the screen, you'll see this is what's called a geared focusing rack. It's called or rail. It's also called by a number of other names. You can see here there's a well here for an Arca Swiss mounting plate for the camera. And instead of focusing the camera, what you do is turn the knob and move the camera back and forth in relation to the subject. Really Right Stuff makes these. Also, there's an L bracket, as you can see where my cursor is going, so you can flip the camera to the vertical position and move the camera back and forth to get focus. That's how shallow depth of field can be. One of the problems with using gear like this is typically you're on a tall tripod. It's pretty tough to get down close to the ground or work on a tabletop. That's where some of the GorillaPod devices come in. This one happens to have a ball head. And you can see how this one is set up with the two legs under the camera and the camera flipped over to our right and to camera left. You could get very, very close to your subject with a very stable platform and undoubtedly get the pictures that you want. Now, I'm not really including anything about lighting in here yet, but you have to keep in mind that both short and tall supports can be needed. You're going to want them to be flexible and adjustable. You're going to want them to be movable. In fact, there's I'm not going to mention names, but there is a company that's featured on the Joby website that actually makes wheels for some of these devices. I haven't tried that, but it's an intriguing idea for both macro and perhaps also for video. So I'm going to be looking into that. You also want to keep your cotton picking fingers off the shutter button. If you don't have a remote shutter release, here's a little workaround for you. It's called the self-timer. Most cameras have a self-timer that will run either 5 or 10 seconds. The issue, of course, is timing the shot if the subject happens to be moving around like an insect. But if you do have a remote shutter release, that's the way. Electronic ones are the way to go. They're not that expensive nowadays. There's both manufacturer and third-party manufacturers that make them. And they're worth their weight in gold for all kinds of purposes, including macro. Now let's talk a little bit about lighting. There's a lot of small subject photography or macro photography. The problem is having enough lighting and the right kind of lighting. And if you're outdoors, of course, it's really a big issue. It helps to have an assistant to hold a diffuser or to hold a secondary or a supplementary light. But if you can bring it indoors, so much the better. And this setup has a couple of problems, which I'll mention. But it's not a bad idea. It's called a white tint. You can actually make this out of a single piece of ripstop nylon, which I won't get into right now. But this is a little bit more manageable, a little bit safer as far as your lighting sources go. You can set this up with frontal or side or cross lighting, and it does give you diffuse light that helps control specular highlights. You can experiment with high key versus low key. So if you follow my cursor, one could put a piece of black material draped from top to bottom right here. That would give you some isolation for the subject, and yet you'd be able to cross light it with these two lights very effectively, or even top light it. The only problem I've got with this setup is I feel like these lights are too close to the fabric, and I think there's a safety issue there. I don't know what kind of bulbs those are, but if they're incandescent bulbs or halogen bulbs, it's definitely too close to material like ripstop nylon. At best, it will start to sag and melt, and at worst, there's a fire hazard. So what you need to do is to back things up a little bit. You may lose a little bit of light because of it. The distance of the top light is fine. The distance of the side light's a little bit too tight for me. Also, I think that the photographer that set this up, this particular stage, is working off a tripod out of convenience, but what would be easier, much easier in a lot of ways, is to push the tent back on the desk and get himself a GorillaPod and get that on the table, and that way you can move the camera around much more easily. You can get better angles on your subject. You can get even closer to the table and have a very, very steady support. So I think in this particular case, he may be using the wrong camera support. And again, don't forget about supporting the subject, and don't forget about getting yourself a remote camera shutter release so that you can trip the camera without moving anything. Now, we had some technical problems with the poll earlier, and I don't know if we've solved those or not. Are we going to be able to do the poll today? Patty, you can just break in and let me know.
We're still seeing zero. No, percentages are coming in, so we will have numbers for you in a moment. I'll read them out to you shortly.
Please read them out. Yeah.
No problem. They are still fluctuating slightly, but basically 98% say they use tripods. A quarter of the people are using a focusing rail. That's interesting. 43% use an extension tube, 12% or 13% use a reversing adapter, and 30% use a macro flash or ring flash. So that's pretty intensive equipment. So this is a pretty dedicated audience you have here, David.
Okay. Do you want to speak about this image, which I know is one of yours?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say, and this has very little to do with macro other than the fact that flower photography and macro photography go hand in hand, is there's a great tendency towards saturation in color photographs, and there's a huge area of potential in reduced saturation in flower photographs. I've gotten more compliments on this image with its reduced saturation than on any poke you in the eye, brilliantly colored photo of flowers that I remember shooting. So this is an interior shot. It's shot up close. It's actually shot with one of the very early mirrorless micro four thirds cameras and a standard lens. There's no specialty macro lens involved. I didn't shoot this with any add-ons. And it's simply a matter of being up close enough with a camera with a high enough resolution that your resulting image is larger than life. That does not require special equipment, folks. And in this case, the same table that the flowers were sitting on in a vase had a lamp on it. And the burnout that you see to the lower right is simply that, yes, that's where the lamp is. Now, I've done variations of this image using specialty software that add rays to the image and other functions like that. But there's nothing wrong with this just as a plain gradiated background underlit flower shot. There's something to be said for the unique light source location and for the reduced saturation. It's just, you've seen a million shots of tulips. Will you remember this one a year from now? Will you remember any other tulip shot that you see a year from now? So this is kind of an issue of artistic intent that almost trumps the technical factors. But keep in mind, I wouldn't have the photo if it was not technically possible to get this close and focus this close and shoot the image.
One of the things I like about your light placement is that it helps, particularly along the right edge over here. The light placement really helps to separate it from the background. It's not just an issue of brightness. You can see some highlights peeking out in different places along the edges, and I think that's one of the things that helps make the photograph.
Well, the eye moves from the upper left to the lower right of nature, and in this instance, the area of highest contrast is definitely the lower right. So there's a certain perversity to forcing your eye to jump over the entire subject matter of the image to get down to the point of highest contrast. It's very much a race that it puts your eye through to go bump across the flowers down to that point of high contrast to see what's really going on in the image.
Yeah, I do feel it's well balanced, though. I want to talk just for a moment about the camera that's shown here. This is one of Nikon's close lighting or macro lighting setups, and you have the light controller on top of the camera. This is expensive but very effective. The light controller on top of the camera and lights side to side that are mounted on a ring so they can be rotated. You can control the amount of light ratios that you're using, the amount of the lighting ratio that you're using left to right. So one side could be significantly brighter than the other, et cetera, et cetera. And so it comes back to the point that I think David was making when he was talking about this photograph, which is that there's a lot of side lighting going on here, and there's definitely a differential or a change in lighting ratios from the right side versus the left, and that can give a lot of dimensionality to your photograph. Okay, we're going to talk for a few minutes about capture color control. Most high-end DSLRs and mirrorless cameras give excellent capture quality when shooting in RAW. It's important to keep in mind that each camera and lens combination has its own color signature. And you can enhance your exposure performance, among other things, by using in-camera white balance, or the in-camera controls. I'm going to back up. You can enhance exposure performance by using a custom white balance versus your in-camera controls. And a custom white balance involves using a target and software and then applying what you might call a profile or a preset to the image in post-production. So that camera calibration really does give you a bump in how things look. And in an image like this one, where you have really opposing colors on the color wheel, green versus magenta, highly saturated areas, really brilliant colors and fine detail, you really want to get everything you can out of the camera. David, you want to comment about this image?
What we're looking at here is a lens baby shot. So lens babies are a natural choice, particularly what I'm going to call the rubber diaphragm, the rubber hose versions are a natural choice for macro shots, because you're taught to push them towards you until the image is in focus. And the answer is yes if you're looking at something far away. But you can learn an inverse technique, which is to put your first and second finger behind the control points on the lens baby and push it away from you as you move in close to a subject. So you can get right down so that a single bee fills the entire frame. Now, the usual function of a lens baby is to make your photo blurry around the edges. Now, macro photography does that for you anyways. It's not as though you really need more blur. This is not a more cowbell situation where more blur is necessary. However, one does not necessarily even recognize a macro as being a lens baby shot. You get in there close enough and it's a picture of a bee. It's not a lens baby shot, because that blurring around the edges is so natural to macro photography that it simply looks like a macro shot rather than specifically a flavored lens baby macro shot.
So the capture color controls, I talked before about, the in-camera white balance versus custom white balance. And this is a subject I've been talking about a lot when I've been speaking with the people at the videography conferences. And it's just as important here as it is there. When you're choosing a color temperature, let's say you use the buttons on the back of the camera, and you choose a color temperature, it's always an approximation. It's never going to nail the environmental color temperature. It's going to be somewhere nearby. But you can see right here the difference between cloudy and shade on this particular camera is 2,000 degrees Kelvin. That's a long stretch. Or between direct sunlight and cloudy. It's a long stretch. Not as long, but it's still pretty long. And so if you're working with a subject that's really demanding high contrast, high saturation, that sort of thing, high detail, you really want to get the exact color temperature. And the way you do that is either to use a spider checker with the gray target, or to use a spider cube and fill the frame, hit the white balance button, and then push the shutter button, and color balance in the camera. Get the custom white balance in the camera so that you can really know that you're shooting directly, the way you're shooting is matched to the environment. And you can get decent photographs by using these white balance presets, but really it's worth the extra effort, which is only a few seconds, to get a custom white balance going rather than using the in-camera white balance. Now you can also use a spider cube in post-production. You can simply place it in the shot, and this happens to be Capture One Pro, but this sort of method works with Lightroom and with Photoshop. And in Photoshop you'd use either the curves, Adobe Camera Raw, or you could do it in the curves or levels adjustment panels. But you'd grab the white balance or color balance eyedropper, and you would click on the brightest side of the spider cube, which is where your primary light is coming from, and you would color balance the photograph. In this software, as in Adobe Camera Raw or in Lightroom, you could then apply that white balance adjustment that using the eyedropper. You could apply that white balance adjustment to all the other photographs in the folder. Saves money, time, and space. So until your lighting situation changes, you could use that adjustment as much as you like. Now let's talk a little bit about software and focus stacking. We said before that depth of field is always an issue with macro photographs or small subject photographs, and the fact is that I deliberately shot this flower on an angle leading away from the camera to demonstrate this technique. If I had done this as a normal macro shot, say I had focused right here on the edge of the flower where the cursor is, everything from about this point to the edge of the frame in both directions would be out of focus. So it would be almost impossible to shoot a flower at this angle with a DSLR. You'd need either a view camera, or you'd need the technique or a tilt-shift lens, or the technique I'm about to describe to you. The way you do this is you combine multiple images of the same subject, and that means you need a very sturdy camera support, one that isn't going to move, a remote release, and you're going to take a series of photographs of this subject and change your point of focus all the way across the subject multiple times. Now, at the beginning, when I first started doing this, I would take maybe 6 or 7 or 8 photographs in a row, all identically framed, point of focus here, point of focus here, point of focus here. And I quickly discovered that you can't have too many points of focus, that 6 or 7 frames is not going to get the job done. In a subject like this, I think I used at least somewhere between 15 and 20. And I combined all of those. And you have to keep in mind that a 105 millimeter lens at f/16 has a depth of field of, half a millimeter. So I put those points of focus all the way across the flower, and then I combine them in the software. And that can be done in Photoshop. It can be done in a specialty software package like Helicon. And at the end of the day, you're going to use the software to blend or combine and create an image with what we call non-planar focus. In other words, three-dimensional focus. And it's not that difficult to do. It's far more difficult to do with a DSLR and a single point of focus, even if you stop it down. Almost impossible. So here's an example of how this works. Here's a bed of leaves in a plant, and I took far more points of focus than I'm actually showing you here. I thought I would keep it simple and not make it look like we had a case of the measles going. And you load them all into Adobe Camera Raw, okay, and make sure that all your exposures and everything else are equilibrated and everything is working just fine. And then you load them as layers, and it's important to name them sequentially. So this is multi-focus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, there were far more than that. I'm doing this for simplicity. They should be loaded in a numeric order so the software knows how to treat them. And then you go up to the menus, and I believe it's under the Edit menu. You go to Auto Blend Layers, and you stack the images with seamless tones and colors. And what it will do is it will flatten the image. It will combine all of those layers and combine the sharpest parts of each image, so you get a depth of field that isn't really possible without special equipment. Now, one of the things I think is very important that I want to mention is display calibration. Frequently in the classes I've been teaching, even recently after all the education work and other things that we've done, I still find that anywhere between a third and a half of the people in the room don't raise their hands when I ask who's calibrating their display. And here's the issue. In fact, I just got a new display that I'm evaluating for an article for Professional Photographer magazine. Pull it out of the box, and the color temperature was around 8,500 degrees Kelvin, which is way too blue, and the brightness was roughly 3 times what one could acceptably use for photography. If I edited photographs with that display and I went to print them, the prints would be far too dark, because obviously if the display is too bright, you try to edit the photo down in luminance to compensate, and then when you make the print, boom, it just isn't going to match your screen. It's not going to meet your expectations. So what I strongly suggest is that if you're not doing display calibration, or your display calibration device is out of date, that you get one and you use it, because it will make all of your editing easier. It will take less time, and you'll spend more time behind the camera instead of in front of the computer. Also, with printing, there's some issues with printer calibration. They're not that different than with display calibration. Instead of using color patches that are displayed on the screen, you print a series of color patches, and you use a scanning device, this device right here, which has a light source and a color sensor in it. You're going to scan each one of these patches in turn, and the computer's going to evaluate whether those patches are correct or not. At that point, it's going to provide you with what's called an ICC profile, and it's going to give you improved color accuracy, a shadow highlight detail, mid-tone transitions, and more. And you're going, at that point, with a calibrated display, you should get a good screen-to-print match. And I need to back up because I forgot to mention something. When I was talking before about the brightness on the screen, I meant to mention that dynamic range is also a part of calibrating your display. In particular, it's particularly important because you look at this image and you look at these butterflies, and this area right here is right on the edge of blowing out. Now, if my screen was too bright, I wouldn't see any highlight detail in here at all. And if the screen was too dark, I might not see any shadow detail down here at all. So when you calibrate the display, you're also managing dynamic range, brightness, and on the lower end and the shadow end. And that really is a big benefit in terms of your editing accuracy and your final outcome. So color calibration or display calibration involves getting the colors right, hue, saturation, and lightness, so that you can edit to a known point and get a good result.
David, that shot is also great for pointing out another thing. I once shot Mexican sunflowers, which are the same color flower on a green background, with monarch butterflies, which are also, orange and black, with a high-end DSLR. At the time I was using the Canon 5D Mark II. And in shooting them, what happened was the camera could find nothing that was white, the camera could find nothing that was gray, the camera couldn't find its way out of a paper bag in terms of seeing white balance. So I got these terribly off white balanced photos. So I reached into my camera bag and pulled out a spider cube to shoot it, thinking I'll use this shot to fix the problem in post. Well, the joke is, once the camera had the cube in front of it, it balanced correctly right in camera, because now it had whites and grays and things to work with. So oftentimes you can set a camera balance to keep you from seeing horrible images on the back of your camera as you're reviewing your images, even though you know you can fix it in post. The fact fixing it up front is really a better deal for your sanity on the day of the shoot.
Yeah, let me expand on that thought. If you do a custom white balance in the camera, we're all shooting RAW. But what many of us don't know is that that RAW file is used to create a JPEG that's your preview on the LCD screen. So if you're shooting in a non-color balanced condition with the camera, that JPEG is going to be distorted, and that JPEG is used to create the histogram that you see on the back of the camera. So in many cases, in a challenging lighting condition, you're far better off doing a custom white balance for your camera, because your color preview on the back is going to be better. You're going to see better highlight and shadow detail, and you're going to get a better histogram. So across the board, Things are better with good color balance in the camera. You can fix things in post, but when you're working in critical and challenging situations, whether you're talking about macro and high levels of detail or scenics where you've got a lot of contrast and bright light and dark shadow areas, you're far better off working with the camera in set up the right way than trying to fix things in post-production. I think between the two of us, we've captured it this time, David, yeah?
I would agree.
Okay. We talked about printer calibration. Okay, now we have a whole host of webinars that we have recorded. We've been doing this for almost 2 years now, I think. We have things on focus control, remote triggering, end-to-end color management, what we call soft proofing, which is also a live color preview while you're editing in Photoshop or Lightroom. There's a recorded webinar on convergence of still and motion capture, which is a big subject nowadays. Floral photography, architectural photography, macro. We've got a whole host of subjects that relate both to Datacolor products and to straight photography. Examples of new webinars coming up. On December 4th, we have an introduction to still image editing and correction, which is co-sponsored by DxO. And on December 5th, we have a really nice webinar coming up on taking control of landscape photography. This is hosted by Datacolor and the Nick Collection. Dan Hughes and I will be presenting that one. I think that's going to be a really nice webinar for those of you who haven't seen much material about the new products from Nick and some of the new techniques that they've developed over the last few months. I just wanted to close with a photograph that I really like. This is the photograph that I was mentioning before that was shot with a 400 lens. So you don't necessarily have, if you have telephoto lenses, you can experiment with doing some small subject, or even you could call this macro. It's the biggest bee I've ever seen in my life. So don't be discouraged if you don't have all the gear. You can still go out and borrow a lens or use one of your telephoto lenses and experiment with it and see what you get. Now I can't see the screen, so David, perhaps you could announce the winners. All right, while we're waiting for David, I want to mention that our promo codes, there's 20% off all Spider products purchased at spider.datacolor.com. It's valid through the 27th. The promo code is macro, and this is for the US only. Our giveaways are a Joby Ultra Fit hand strap, a GorillaPod Focus with ball head, and a Spider lens cowl.
And the winners are, of the Joby hand strap, Mark Kovner, and of the Joby GorillaPod, David Harding, and of the lens cowl, Suzanne Miller. I'd like to thank you all for having names that I can pronounce. Our marketing manager will get in touch with each of you at the email that you used to sign up for this webinar to ask you where you would like your prizes shipped. So congratulations, and thank you for attending.
And I'll just close by saying that my blog at davidsaffir.wordpress.com and David Tobie's blog at cdtobie.wordpress.com, both of these blogs have a nice library of technical and photography information on them. Feel free to browse and see what you can turn up that might be of interest to you. I also want to mention that I do answer email questions from my students. My email is dsaffir, S-A-F-F-I-R, @mac.com. I'm traveling quite a bit right now between now and the beginning of December. It may be that I miss your email on the first pass. Please don't be afraid to bug me and send it again. I'll do my best to answer your emails as I can in my travel schedule. Thank you all for attending. I hope that you can all rejoin us again at the beginning of December for our next 2 webinars. Thanks, and have a great day.